my mother and father were born in Bisceglia, Italy, and I don't know whether they knew each other as children, but my mother came here when she was 26, and my father was already here. His one brother had come from Bisceglia and was established here, and then they would have relatives come here when they had somebody to take care of them. So anyway, my mother's family, her mother died during the plague, you know, so she had, there were 4 in the family, and she stayed there to help her father with the other, I think it was 3 children. So she didn't come here till she was 26, and stayed with an uncle, Storelli, here in Fresno. And then my father, I don't know whether it was a fixed up marriage or they knew each other from there. I don't know. I never did get that story straight. But anyway, they did get married, my father and my mother, and they had, you know, their family here. My father was already established. He was a farmer. And, you know, they had a good life. We all lived on one block. It was a lot of relatives, all Italians, you know, in that neighborhood. Families that had sisters and were married. You know, it was just a whole family deal. My husband's family lived about a block away, you know, with their group of Italians. So, you know, we just grew up being, we weren't rich. We grew up during the Depression, you know. So everybody didn't have anything, but we didn't realize we didn't have anything. We had a family, we had a house to live in, you know, a home to live in. We have a big garden. My father would plant all these vegetables and stuff, you know, in the yard. And we never felt poor. I went to Columbia and went to Edison, graduated from Edison, and you know, the war was on. You know, I graduated in '43, got a job right after high school at Has Brothers in Fresno, and I was planning to go to college, but it was so easy to get a job. My husband was got into the Army after that, you know, so I don't know whether I should bring that up or not,
Sure,
or we're still talking about me. So anyway, I worked at Has Brothers for a couple of years, and then I worked in a dental office, Dr. Griffin engaged. And then by that time, my husband had come back he was stationed in the Aleutian Islands. So then he came home. And we were kids, we kind of grew up together. You know, we were high school, we went together during high school off and on. He lived only a block away, but I didn't really, we didn't associate with that group, you know. But I knew Tony from high school, and we always liked each other, but we didn't get serious till, well, late teenagers, you know. So then when he got back from the service, well, we got back together and got married in '43. We had our first child in '47. We had Dave in '49. And that was our 2 children. And then we had 5 grandchildren and 7 great-grandchildren with, you know, Tony and I.
I think, you know, it's interesting to kind of hear about the history of that time and, you know, that neighborhood. Like my mom said, they both lived on A Street right off of Fresno. And so, you know, they lived within a block of each other. You know, my mom had 3 brothers and a sister, and my dad had, you know, 2 brothers and 3 sisters. The bottling works was actually in their yard. So they grew up, you know, as part of the business from the time they could, you know, probably walk. So he was the youngest of 6, and so he pretty much, like I say, you know, was involved in the business, but also, you know, the family was really, you know, tight in those days, and that, you know, everything revolved around your family or your relatives, and then your neighbors, you know. And so, you know, I think it was a pretty secure kind of way to grow up. You know, again, they didn't have a whole lot. You know, my grandfather started the business. He came here in '06, and his plan was, his brother had come the year prior to that and was running a hotel in San Francisco. So his plan was to join his brother in running the hotel. And so right after he got here, the earthquake happened. And so that was the end of the hotel. It was destroyed. So he had to, you know, come up with a different plan. And, you know, he had grown up in northern Italy, Cugno, which is kind of on the border of France and Italy. And, you know, they were pretty poor. You know, as a young boy, he worked as a shepherd for a while. They would kind of farm him out to landowners, and that was a common thing for the boys. And they would spend the summer working as a shepherd and make a few bucks that way, and then come back in the fall. So, you know, I think he always worked, which is true of pretty much everybody then. And, you know, the idea was to come to America where there was more opportunity to move up. You know, you were pretty fixed in your status in Italy. There wasn't a whole lot of opportunity to, you know, to get ahead. So the idea was to come here and work hard. So, I mean, I think, you know, that got instilled into my father, definitely. So, you know, he grew up with his brothers, and, you know, I think my grandfather was you know, pretty strict, but I think, you know, had a really good heart, and I think my grandmother as well. And everything they did, like I say, they kind of did together. They formed a band at some point. My dad and my 2 uncles to make a little extra money, so they played music. He got drafted during World War II, and so I think that was the first time he'd really been, you know, away. That I don't think, you know, they did a whole lot other than, you know, be in town and work in the business. So being away and going overseas and that whole experience, I think he never really talked about that very much. But I'm sure that was life-changing. But, you know, when he got through, he came back and just picked up where he left off. And by then, my grandfather was getting older, so both his brothers and he just stepped into the business and you know, carried that on. In '09, my grandfather had moved to Fresno. He had relatives in in Clovis, and so he had moved here, and he had the idea that you know, it was hot in the valley and that would be a good place to sell soda water. So he decided to pursue that, and he had a relative that he went into business with. And I think originally it was called the Clovis Bottle Works, because it was in Clovis. And so the plan was for the relative to go out and make sales and travel around the valley and wherever and get orders, and then my grandfather would produce, and then he would go down to the train station, you know, put the orders on the train, and they would go from there. But fairly soon, I think within probably the first year, he didn't feel like his cousin was really working that hard. And so he ended up buying him out, and I think he moved the business to originally on E Street somewhere, again pretty close to the neighborhood that he settled in, and then, you know, moved it to A Street, and you know, I was in a shed next to the house. And it was a real primitive kind of industry in those days. It was pretty much everything was done by hand. Each bottle was filled by hand. It was corked by hand. They cooked up the syrup and washed the bottles by hand, and delivered them. I think you know, he pretty much was a one-man crew. I know my grandmother participated, and then as the kids were born and grew up, they did too. But I think in the early days there wasn't much beyond the family that did that, and he was able to, you know, to establish himself. I don't remember him much because I think I was about 3 when he passed away. I can remember playing in the yard with him. He had a blacktop yard where the trucks were, and the only thing I can remember rolling a hoop around and him running
He had that
around with me.
basketball deal up there.
Yeah.
And all the kids in the neighborhood would gather there and play basketball. They had a big front yard, but the factory was toward the alley, you know, where they did the bottling, right, Dave?
Yeah. It was,
And then the house, their house was right there, so they all lived in the house. And the kids all participated with the washing the bottles when you kids, not you, but your brothers and your
uncles.
Cousins, or what were they, nieces or nephews? I don't know what they were to you. I can't think of it right now. But anyway, it was kind of family, you know, business at the time. But he managed to support his 6 children with the soda, you know, business. And he would go around with a cart with the soda around the neighborhood, and everybody knew our flavors. I mean, I can still remember people coming up to me and saying, "Oh, I love the strawberry." Not too much anymore because they're all gone. But, you know, different flavors, the cream, we had about 10 different flavors, right, Dave?
Yeah, I
At
mean,
least.
originally, when he was, you know, making it by hand, he'd make a case of this, a case of that, and it'd be all, I mean, he'd come up with some pretty unique kinds of flavors. Probably if somebody wanted a certain thing, he'd make it.
Yeah.
But it got down to eventually just six of the flavors. But, you know,
he was a hard worker.
Yeah, I mean, he survived startup and then the Depression. You know, soda wasn't on the top of the list of what to spend your money on. So, you know, those were hard times, but he made it through that. And then the war, there were rationing on things that he couldn't get to produce
The
it.
sugar.
Sugar was rationed, some other things. So, you know, it was not an easy journey for them, but he always made it work, you know, and I think that's just, you know, a testament to how hard he worked. And, you know, the little I can hear from people that knew him was that, you know, he was very honest. He had a great personality. He knew everybody, and just was a real decent guy. I don't know that they ever, you know, thought about doing anything else. To be honest, I think it was just a given that, you know, that they were going to work in the business. You know, I never heard either my dad or my uncles talk about, you know, well, I wish I had done this, or, you know, I was planning to do this, but, you know, ended up staying with the business. I think it was just something that they grew up in, and they, you know, just planned on, you know, on carrying it on. And so, you know, when they all got out of, the war ended, they all came back, and, you know, I think they just, you know, just picked up. My grandfather, like I say, was, you know, in his 60s, and he was getting ready to, you know, to quote retire, and so I don't think he ever really did. He was always, you know, around since it was still in his backyard, but you know, they took up more and more of, you know, of the business. And my dad worked primarily in producing, you know, the soda. My uncles both, you know, were out in the community, you know, selling. And that kind of was just a natural division and that's the way it stayed, you know, for the rest of their time.
Well, when the boys took over the business, your father, it turned out to be Calandra and Sons instead of Calandra Brothers, right? That was what year was that, Dave?
Probably right after the war.
Yeah, it was probably 46, 45, something like that. And so then it got to be Calandra and Calandra Brothers, the three brothers. And so they moved to the factory on East Street, right?
Yeah, I mean, I
after they took over.
Yeah, it had to be, I was about 5 or 6 when they moved. So I can remember the original plant in my grandparents' yard. You know, it was,
well, you
like
were
I
just
say,
a little
very
baby then.
Well, I was, 5 or 6 when they moved, but I can remember going up the stairs to, you know, where they had the sugar, and they would liquefy it, and then gravity would take it downstairs.
There was a lot of work in that little old shed. They had to climb up a ladder and lift up. Your father did that a whole lot.
Yeah.
Before he even...
A lot of sacks of sugar went up those stairs.
When they were kids, they would do that kind of stuff, you know.
Yeah,
it was a hard life, but they enjoyed it. They all got along. They all were musicians, all the boys. They got to learn an instrument. They were in their own bands and helped with the family. It's just a good family, you know.
But they were able to, the business started growing. They started, having other people, working. They had, 5 or 6 trucks. And so they moved to E Street, right off of Fresno. Again, not very far, but it was like... it
was a big plant.
10 times the size of the other plant. They got new machinery so that they could produce more. So that's when it really started to, take a step forward and become more of a growing kind of business. And at that time, they got a Dr. Pepper franchise, which was a new drink, certainly to this area. And that turned out to be, a major kind of driver of them growing and becoming, a bigger business, and that became their you know, their number one product. But yeah, they moved into that new plant and just gradually kept getting bigger and bigger. Yeah, I can remember going there on Saturdays with my cousin when we were still little and just playing around, and there were big holes in the cement, you know, and eventually we started doing a little bit of work there when we were still pretty young. On Saturdays we'd go and, you know.
You did a lot of loading of trucks, you and Craig.
Yeah, later, as we got older, it became,
Yeah.
you know, it became a full-time job at some point. But, you know, growing up, that was, you know, kind of the hub. And you know, when they did something, they had friends outside of the family, but a lot of what they did socially was with their brothers and sisters. So you would think they would get tired of each other by then, working, you know, 6 days a week, but they were all real close, and the women all were close. My three aunts, they moved away from Fresno, but as they grew up, I mean, when they were young, they were involved in the business too. You know, it was, I had three cousins. My Uncle Jim had three boys. Two were older than me, and one was like 6 months younger than I was. So, you know, we all kind of took the same path. As you got older, you started doing a little more, and then early teens, we started working summers. You know, we'd go in the morning, you know, start up the line until the regular guys got there, and then we'd do, you know, whatever during the day, and we'd be done by after lunch in the beginning. So my mom would come and pick us up, and my aunt, you know, at 1 when the guys got back from lunch. And so that's what we did for a few years, and then gradually, you know, in high school it became, you know, kind of an all-day job in the summer, and then there was, you know, started to load trucks at night, and so that was year-round. And you know, it just, you know, we all stayed with the business initially. My three cousins and I. My Uncle Pete, who was the oldest son, his son he you know, worked there summers, but he didn't stay. He ended up going on his own career. So he was not in the business after he went to college, but the three of them and I, we pretty much stayed with it, you know, until they sold the business. So I guess when I was about 18, they moved out to Malaga, out on Central Avenue in 99. And again, that was a huge jump. We got new machinery. You didn't have to put on the empties by hand. You didn't have to take off the full ones by hand. You know, they had casers and uncasers and labeling machines, and so that was kind of getting into the, you know, 21st century kind of stuff. So that was a big change, and you know, they were real proud of that they were able to see that change from backyard to, you know, a big bottling plant. They pretty much were just in the valley. The way they kind of did the, you know, if you got a distributorship for a product, you know, it was tied to a region. So, you know, their Dr. Pepper, there were other bottlers that were outside of, you know, Fresno County, and so they would have that area. We would have, you know, the area around Fresno, and so they kind of regulated that, and you know, it was just economics too, and that you know, you stayed within where you could get and how much you could produce, and so a day's drive, you know, was pretty much it. And you know, they had worked, like I say, from the time they had started growing up. So I think they started looking at, maybe getting out of the business when my uncle Jim, the middle boy, he died in a plane wreck in like 68, I think. It was either 67 or 68.
68, I think.
And he and his wife, and then my cousin Craig's wife's family, her mom and dad, they had gone together on a trip, and there was in the Azores, I think, there was a crash, and that another plane taking off ran into their plane, and so pretty much everybody died in that, and so that was obviously a shock and a major major change for them, and I think that was kind of the catalyst for them to start thinking about maybe it was time. I don't think I know I wasn't interested in continuing, and my cousins, maybe not, but I think the idea was that this would be a good time. You've worked your whole lives, and you have an opportunity to again, because of the Dr. Pepper, to sell the business to a bigger, and that was the kind of the trend in the industry as it kept going, was to get bigger and bigger, and the bigger places were bodying out the small ones as continued to happen, and so I don't think they had the drive at that point to say we're going to expand. I think it was time, and so I think that was really good. I think it was surprising to me because I wondered what he would do with his life, because he didn't really have any hobbies. It was pretty much work, and then see some of his friends with my mom, and but outside of the business there wasn't a whole lot that he had as interest, so I was kind of worried that he was not going to know what to do with himself, and basically that turned out.
But he retired when he was 54, and he worked hard all his life. I mean, as a young kid, your father you're talking about. And
but he seemed to enjoy his
retired
retirement.
when he was 54, and like Dave said, they were just a hard-working bunch all their lives. And so when he retired, as a young kid, they didn't have that much time for pleasure, to do their own thing. But after he retired, he got to go to the gym. He played racquetball, and we did a lot of traveling and had a good life. It was worth it, right, Dave? You kids were all happy for him.
Yeah,
for us. For him retiring.
It seemed like it worked out really.
He
really
always
well.
played drums. Your family was always making sure that the kids got what they could give them. They all played an instrument, and it was a good life.
Yeah, they had a lot of energy, But no, we were really pleased.
But your father, after the service, he could have gone to college, but he didn't because he stayed in the business.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Yeah, I think that was, and then just going back to, to my mom's family, again, for my grandma and grandpa, coming to this area, there were a lot of people that were farmers in agriculture that were drawn to the valley because of the climate, and also because there were people here, relatives, and that would draw the next group. And So I think, it was...
They picked the right place to settle down, really. The weather was very much like it was where they came from,
Right.
So.
Yeah, and I mean, my mom was the second youngest, and she had, her older brother, then an older sister, then my mom, then my her younger brother, and then the youngest one. And so, they stayed, none of them, they all worked independently, but they stayed really, really close together, all holidays. You would either have one side of the family or the other, and pretty much, that was a set schedule. You meet them. We'd go on vacations together. That was a big deal for us. We got 1 week
We were all
a
close,
year
that
we'd go to Santa Cruz, and my mom and my aunts from my dad's side, the guys would drive them up on the weekend, drop them off. They'd go back to work, and then they'd come up the next weekend and pick us up and take us home. So, holidays, vacations, we kind of spent those together as well. And as far as, cousins, that was really a cool thing, because, I had a lot of cousins, and, when we would get together, we'd just have a great time. We'd play, and, there was always, quite a few around at different holidays and birthdays and whatever. So I enjoyed that. I don't think I appreciated it as much as growing as a kid. I just took it for granted that that's how it is. And, we've seen that kind of change. I think most families have seen that. And that, especially when the business kind of ended, everybody did their own thing. And so, families, again, have their own lives. They get bigger, they separate, they move. And so, I think we were lucky in that, we got to experience that. And, I feel a little bad for our kids, because, they won't have that kind of a relationship, with their
they all have their
cousins
own lives to lead, and it just seems like
it's different.
people separate, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
But
the world
they're
has
all
definitely changed.
Doing well.
Yeah, we've been very
We
fortunate.
wish them well. We played with the children on our block.
Mm-hmm.
We would play out in the street, games. I mean, we didn't have cars to worry about, We would all play outside and hide and seek, or different games like that. And growing up, I had I only had one sister, and I got along with my brothers better than my sister. She was the oldest one in the family. She was a good sister, and I would cook and bake. They all loved to be in the kitchen. People can remember coming over to my house, and the first thing we do is bake something, And my father always worked hard. My mother was at home. We were 7 at one time, but 2 of my brothers had passed away. But going to school, we would just walk to school. It was close. Columbia wasn't that far from 8th Street. And Addison wasn't that far either. I mean, I could remember coming home for lunch. We would have fun just running across the fields and getting home. Mom she'd be frying potatoes. That was her main, fried potatoes and eggs. We'd come home and eat run back to school. And other than that, you know, it was just relatives again, because we had all our relatives right around us. You know, my uncle lived a couple houses away. My other uncle lived up on Pato. And we would always do things with that side of the family too. And you know, when we graduated, well, then the war started, so that changed a whole lot, you know. And I remember buying the first car, you know, that Plymouth.
I don't remember that.
Of course, my father had a truck, you know, but the first car was a big deal. We got married in '47, and I had my daughter in '49, and Dave in '51. And like I said, then we had the 5 grandchildren, and then 7 great-grandchildren. And I worked just very little. And then I think I probably got, well, you know what we did in those days? We got married and had kids. I mean, legally. You know what I mean? Now people just have them. I mean, they shouldn't have them, really. But, you know, we got married and didn't worry about having a family. I mean, that was it. He didn't, my husband, well, I worked maybe a couple years when we were married. Maybe not even a couple years. And then he would rather that I stay home and take care of the kids. And he had his own car. Then this was after the service. Cars were hard to get. Everything was hard to get. But I will say my husband was a very good provider. His father taught him when he was a young man to keep track of everything that he spent, you know, and which is a good idea. I don't know whether it rubbed off on you or not. But well, you had more than they did, you know what I mean, or that I did. And I think we spoiled our kids a whole lot more because we had more and we gave them more, which is happening nowadays, you know. That was when the plant, he was still working at the plant on 8th Street. Well, we lived on places were hard to get after the war. You think it's bad now. Well, it was worse then. You couldn't find an apartment to move into. My cousin had a place on Fresno Street, a real nice house. And they had a nice little cottage in the back, you know, on Fresno Street. And so somebody moved out of their little apartment, so we were lucky enough to get it, and it was darling, Hyundai.
I've seen pictures of it.
You were just a little boy when we moved out of there. You were only a year old.
No, I saw pictures.
But we had Diane there, and then you came along. But we got this little apartment, or little house. It was a living room, a dining room, a bedroom, and a bathroom, you know, and kept up really well, the yard, in a big yard, lawn. He would go to work early in the morning and wouldn't come home till 7 o'clock, 8. I mean, he was a really hard worker. So when he retired, I was really happy he did.
You know, it was a mix. You know, I think the idea of keeping traditions alive didn't really become a thing until maybe our generation. It was just kind of, you know, part of your upbringing, and so you did, you know, you carried on certain things, but it wasn't like we need to keep this alive until later. So, you know, Italian food was just a part of normal, you know, you had sauce and pasta on Sundays. And maybe during the week sometime too. You had, some basic kinds of things. It was interesting, my dad's family, they were more focused on, kind of being American in the sense that they didn't speak Italian. My grandfather spoke French and Italian and English.
With your grandfather,
Yeah.
she didn't speak any Italian because she wanted him to learn the English language. See?
Yeah.
So
And I know,
that's why you didn't know any Italian.
And I
You
know
didn't
the-
know
the
any,
kids-
but I knew. I would
Yeah, you
speak
spoke.
Italian to my mother and father. It was, it was normal for them to talk to us kids. So I can relate. Well, of course, I've forgotten most of it, but we talked a lot of Italian in our home when we were growing up to our parents, because it was a different generation, for them to be here.
yeah, and I think Dad's family, they didn't.
They were from the Clovis area, and they were more Americanized than we were on
Yeah.
our block.
And I think that was, a driving kind of thing of, you're in America, you speak English,
Yeah, that
that's
was
that's
more
the
that
way
type
to
of thing.
get along. So, but I think, we definitely carried on traditions, and then it became more of a priority as we got older. Linda and I, had our kids, then it was like, well, we want to learn how to do this. We want to learn how to make ravs. We want to learn how to,
We brought our tradition.
make this cookie or that. And so, it became a priority to keep those things going, include the kids in part of that preparation. Linda put together a cookbook with, some of those recipes. And so then, that, like I say, became an important thing where, in your generation, it was more just the way things were. It wasn't like, oh, let's keep this going. It was just, that's how it is. And so you did what you knew. So, I'm real grateful that we got a chance to learn how to do some of those things and
We
to
still
carry
do them
those things
together,
on. Yeah.
Our traditions you never lose that part of it. I've had a great life. I've got great kids. Can't complain. That's why I'm still here.